I'd like to introduce Dan Taylor, who's a practicing town planner and he's a member of the Coventry Society, and I'd like to thank him very much for agreeing to give us this presentation. I think it's a really important thing we're discussing here today, and for that reason we open this meeting up not just to society members, but we've also promoted it to local residents and heritage groups because we think it might impact them as well. So with that, I'll pass over to Dan. If you put yourselves on speaker view, and then you'll see Dan as the main speaker and avoid all the confusion.
That's great, thanks, John. No, I'm pleased to give this talk. I mean, it's consumed a lot of my professional life in the last month or two. So yeah, no, it's good to be able to give this to all of you. So I'll just try and share my screen now. Hopefully this will work. Okay, so hopefully you'll just see the slideshow now. Fine. Okay, so yeah, this is the future of the English planning system. As I say, yeah, the government has brought out a lot of changes, so I'm just going to run through as quickly as I can through them now. And I'll start with this slide because to show how important this is to the government, the Prime Minister has actually done a foreword as part of the white paper, which is quite unusual because normally it's just the Secretary of State for that department that will put their foreword on. But the fact that the Prime Minister has decided to write within the planning white paper is quite significant and shows how serious the government are taking it. And he's referred to it as a radical reform unlike anything we have seen since World War II. And I've just put some radical reform pictures of following World War II that some of you will probably recognise. This presentation, so this is going to cover the permitted development rights first, and also the changes to the use classes order, just because those are now in. They're in force, and we are using them as part of my sort of day-to-day work. And then I'll go on to the planning white paper after that, which is currently out to consultation, due to finish at the end of this month. And I'll just run through what it's looking to do. So it's looking to change probably most parts of the planning system. So from local plans to their to sort of new zoning, big emphasis on digital within the planning system, right through the whole stretch of the planning system. Its emphasis on sort of design and placemaking and beauty, and also how it's looking to extract contributions from developers and landowners. So taking the existing Section 106 and community infrastructure levy mechanisms at the moment and changing that slightly with the aim of trying to get more revenue out of developments. So if I start with the permitted development rights first, so throughout August, the government was busy publishing a lot of new statutory instruments, and it came in 3 rounds. So they're all the town and country planning general permitted development order. The first one came in at the beginning of August, entitled the coronavirus regulations. Then we had 2 at the end of August, which were called number 2 and number 3 amendments. So these were the 3 that came in, and that I'll talk to you about over the next few slides. So the permitted development rights round 1, there was 3 main changes. The first one was to do with ensuring natural light was assessed as part of any change of use. So this mainly came about because you might know of the office to residential change of use that you could do. So a developer could change an office block and put them all into residential flats, make flats. But as part of changing it, there was never a requirement to assess daylight into those new flats. So you could theoretically have a new flat without any windows in it. And the government have sought to change that to ensure that natural light is an assessment criteria that the local government has to look at when it looks at these types of applications. The other one was sort of temporary land use changes, which came about through the pandemic that we're in now. So it was about allowing local authorities to change land, mainly, I suppose, in town centres. So it'd be things like seating outside or markets or something just to help businesses through the time that we're in at the moment. And then the last thing was to introduce the construction of new homes on detached blocks of flats. And that's the one I'm just going to run through quickly now, just so you get an idea of what the government is doing with all these permitted development right changes. So this allowed up to 2 additional stories of new flats on top of already purpose-built detached blocks of flats. And the restrictions all include things like the heights, the maximum height of the building, how high each additional floor can be. So for example, on this one, so there's a requirement for when the building had to be built. So this is between July 1948 and March 2018. And then it looks at the existing building must be more than 3 meters, must be more than 3 stories already. And that each floor can't be more than 3 meters in height. The overall height of those additional floors can't be more than 7 meters. And then the extended building overall can't be greater than 30 meters. So there are still restrictions on how high these buildings can be, but the emphasis is all on creating new flats and new houses. And obviously it's not applicable to listed buildings or buildings in conservation areas. So permitted development rights round 2. Now this created 5 new use classes. And essentially it's all about, again, creating additional flats without the need for applying for planning permission. The top one is to do with enlarging of existing houses and creating extensions on top of your existing house. And then the other 4 are to do with creating new flats on either detached or terrace buildings, whether they're in mixed or commercial use or whether they are already in residential use, but you can add up to 2 additional stories on top of them as well. The restrictions to those are quite similar to the slide before. So I'm going to focus on the enlargement to the dwelling house one on the next slide. Again, just so you get an idea of what the restrictions are on that one. So you can apply for 2 additional stories on your house if your house is 2 or more stories, or one additional story if your house is just a single story, so like a bungalow, for example. And again, there are the date restrictions here. So it must be your house must have been there between 1948 and July 1948 and October 2018. And again, it talks about restrictions on how high your floor to ceiling heights can be, the overall height, such as the extended building couldn't be more than 18 meters in height. Again, it doesn't apply for listed buildings or areas or sites in conservation areas. And it kind of distinguishes between detached properties and attached properties. So when your house is either a semi-detached or a terrace, the extended part of the house can't be more than 3.5 meters higher than your immediate neighbor if it's a semi-detached house, so the neighbor that you share your party wall with, or the other buildings within the row if you're in a terrace. So there are some restrictions for going higher than 3.5 meters. Basically what this means is if you wanted to do anything over and above these height restrictions, you would just have to apply for planning permission. But this is what allows you to do through this sort of prior approval route without applying for full planning permission. And I'll talk about the prior approval a bit later. So I've got a slide to explain exactly what that is, in case you're not familiar with it. And then finally, the round 3 of permitted development rights. So this allowed for demolition and rebuild. So the government is allowing for the demolition of a single purpose-built block of flats or any detached building that's within use class B1A, and that's mainly office use or any combination of that. And the government's allowing you to demolish that and replace that with a single building comprising purpose-built detached blocks of flats for the purpose of say, residential development. And the old building must have been constructed before 31st December 1989. And importantly, it must have been vacant for a period of at least 6 months immediately prior to the date of you applying to the council to demolish the building and build your new residential block. The new building must fall within the footprint of the old building, and it can't exceed 1,000 square meters. It also can't exceed 7 meters above the height of the old building, or be higher than 80 meters in total. And you can only do a maximum of 2 additional stories. I mean, with all these permitted development rights, because there are quite a few restrictions on them, it's going to be telling over the months and years how much people will take this up, how developers, landowners will take this up, because you can't build, for example, in this circumstance, you couldn't build a building that's greater than the existing footprint of the building that's already there. So it might be restrictive in that sense, and maybe not something that a lot of developers can take up, and they might just have to apply for full planning permission if they want that bigger building, or to extend it beyond the parameters that there are here. So yeah, just to sum up the changes to the permitted development rights. So they all require prior approval to be obtained from the local authority. So that means you're still having to apply to the council to say what you want to do. But it's not a full planning permission, so it's not got the same amount of you don't have to submit the same amount of information, and it's not assessed under the same criteria as a full planning permission would. However, the council still have to assess a prior approval application, taking into account aspects such as transport, design and external appearance of the new building, impacts on existing properties, so probably mainly residential, and also the impacts from existing buildings in the area. So that's probably mainly for things like commercial or industrial uses. If you've got them close by, the authority would have to take them into account, and also flooding and contamination risk. So again, the authority still has the power to refuse a prior approval, and the design external appearance allows them to assess that additional height, and what impact that will have on the streetscape, on the local area, and also the impact on the neighbours. I mean, the point that the government, whether you agree with these permitted development rights or not, the whole point is, the spirit of them is that the government wants additional houses to be built. And so it will be telling to see how local authorities react to it, react to these additional heights, and whether how many get refused on the external appearance aspect, or whether the local authorities accept what the government are trying to do and allow additional height, in various places. So it will just be telling over the years how local authorities do react to these changes. And also the government still has a level of control in the form of their Article 4 powers. And what Article 4 is that local authorities can impose in areas of their boundary for these permitted development rights to be removed. So a classic one is probably office to residential, again, which has been in for a while now. But local authorities could, for example, exclude their city centres to say, we put an Article 4 direction on their city centres, for example, and say, you can't, permitted development rights from office to residential, doesn't exist, and you would always have to apply for planning permission in those sorts of areas. So they still do have their powers under that if they wanted to impose them in certain areas of the city or the town. So in a nutshell, that is all the permitted development right changes. I'll move on to the use classes order. So this is a slide I've taken from Litchfields, who do some very good analysis of all these changes. And if you're not aware of what the use classes order is, it's basically all different uses categorized together. So retail is one use class, restaurants and pubs, they're another use class, offices are a different use class, residential is another, and then your community and your education and those sorts of use classes, again, are all different use classes. And to change between them all, you would normally have to apply for planning permission. So what the government is now doing is it's reduced the number of use classes that there are out there, and combining your sort of typical city centre use classes, if you like. So your shops, your restaurants, your offices, some of your community and sports uses, all into one use class, which means that you will no longer need to apply for planning permission to change between all those uses. And use classes are different to permitted development rights, because this is just not development under planning that requires planning permission, where permitted development rights, they're still development under planning that would technically require planning permission, but the government is just allowing you to do things under certain conditions without actually applying for planning permission. But here, it's just not development. And that's quite important. I hope that makes sense, but that was quite important just because local authorities can't use their Article 4 powers in this circumstance, because it is just not development that requires planning permission. So, for example, here, you'll see at the top sort of shops, sort of that turquoisey blue colour is everything that's going to change to what's called the new Class C. So that's going to incorporate shops and restaurants and offices into the same use class under what's called use class E. They all used to be different use classes. So shops used to be A1, restaurants were A3, financial and professional services were A2, all your offices were B use classes, and your community and your educational uses were all in D use classes. That was just the letter that was given to them. But they're now all under E. Class F is also in a use class that's come in, and that takes a lot of your community and educational uses and puts them together. And then your sui generis uses, now that is just, they're kind of their own use, and changing any sui generis use always needs planning permission to change between. And what the government have done here is they've taken pubs and put them into sui generis, which actually provides them with more protection. So you can no longer, so before these came in on the 1st of September this year, you could change between pubs and a restaurant, for example, without applying for planning permission. Where now your pubs are protected, and you always require planning permission to change the use of a pub into whatever use you wanted to. And obviously all the residential uses, which are all C, which you can see on the right hand side there. So your C1 was hotel, and your C3 was dwelling houses or flats. They're still their own use classes, and they stay separate. So in a nutshell, that is the use classes order. It's, if you don't know it already, sorry, that's probably quite a quick run through that you might not have sort of been able to keep up with. But in a nutshell, it's to allow more flexibility for town centres. Basically, it's to allow people who have a shop and want to change it into another sort of town centre type use, whether that's an office or a gym or anything like that. I mean, this will have big implications for local authorities, because a lot of their local plan policies seek to protect shops, and they want a certain percentage of shops on their high streets or their city centres. And this will kind of do away with those policies, because you could change the precinct, for example, in Coventry to and get rid of all the shops and change them to different uses within Class C without applying for planning permission. So it will have quite big implications. And I say all those retail protection policies that Coventry will have, for example, in its local plan. You could, might not, no longer have that, serves its purpose that it once did to protect shops. But I think the government has just seen it as trying to react to town centres changing quite dramatically, a lot of online shopping, and there's been a lot of articles written about COVID and how that is changing city centres, because people are doing a lot more online shopping, and shops sadly are closing down, and what's going to happen to those units, and not to have them all vacant, and to allow them to, the owners of those to change those units, whether it's into restaurants or something that allows the high street not to be full of vacant shops because of all the policies to do with protecting shops. So there's lots of for and against it. I suppose you can make your own mind up whether you think this is a good idea, but this is just part of the government's way of sort of helping town centres to sort of diversify a bit more. So yeah, so just to sum up what I was saying there, really, that yeah, the changes to the changes of use within the same use class do not constitute development requiring planning permission. This is obviously subject to site-specific issues. So if planning permission has been given for a certain site and that's got conditions on that prevent it from changing use, then the condition on that planning permission will still be the fundamental thing you have to abide by. So that's why it can be site-specific still, if there are conditions on that particular site. The existing use must be obviously a lawful planning use. It doesn't necessarily be active. It could have been vacant and it hasn't been used for a while, but as long as its last lawful use was within the same use as you want to change it to, then that's fine. And planning permission is still required for any external or facilitating works in association with the change of use. So the use classes order only deals with change of use. It doesn't deal with any external changes. If you need to put extra doors in or windows or anything like that to facilitate the new use, you still have to apply for planning permission for that. It's important to say that there's currently a High Court legal challenge at the moment through these new use classes and also the permitted development rights. So this has been brought against the government through a lack of consultation or parliamentary debate, and also because they don't consider the government has taken an environmental assessment or the equalities impact assessment enough. It'll be interesting to see what the High Court comes out with. That's being heard this month, it should be. So that'll probably come out sort of in the next few months, the decision on that. But I mean, we anticipate that these changes will still come in, and if the government has to change anything, it will probably, just as it would usually does, it just tweak things or go through that process, but it will still bring these changes in. I don't think anything will stop these changes, but they might just have to do a bit more consultation potentially, or a bit more work to meet maybe the environmental assessment. But we don't expect the changes to be completely quashed. I think these are in now, but it'll be interesting to see what the High Court does decide in the next few months anyway. Fine, so that's a very quick run through our permitted development rights and the use classes order, which I say are in force. I'm submitting applications for clients on these new use classes orders and on the new permitted development rights. So they are in force at the moment. So I'll now move on to the white paper, which is planning for the future. And this came out for consultation on the 6th of August, and it runs until the end of this month, so the 29th. So I suppose I'll put some quotes on there from the white paper. So it's basically the government is setting out plans to overhaul an outdated planning system as it sees, and to reform the way the country builds. But importantly, it does say that planning matters, which with this Tory government, you never quite know, but they've made it clear. Ministers have said they think planning has a place, it matters, and this white paper is to reform it and not just to completely abolish it or to change it beyond all recognition. But planning does matter, is what the document says. Yeah, it's for a major reform of the planning system, and it includes changes to how local plans are developed, how developer contributions are managed, and also the development management arm, so how planning officers assess applications and decide on whether planning permission should be given or not. And the proposals are intended to speed up the delivery and give more certainty by making the planning system a bit more rules-based, and I'll explain what that means through the next few slides. But the planning white paper, there's 3 pillars to it. There's planning for development, there's planning for beauty and sustainable places, and there's planning for infrastructure and connected places. So I'll just go through those 3 pillars one by one over the next few slides. So pillar 1, planning for development. So we have a plan-based system in this country. So for those who maybe aren't familiar with it, it's basically all local authorities have a local plan, and they have a series of policies covering everything from new houses to industrial facilities to commercial, whatever it is, whatever the city or town needs. Local authorities develop their local plan, set policies for how they want their city or town to develop, and that is what developers or landowners have to abide by, and that's what decision makers in the council also have to take into account when they're assessing whether planning permission should be given for certain developments. So we still have a plan-based system that is staying, but the new local plans are intended to be more map-based. At the moment, they are very wordy. Policies are quite wordy policies, but what the government wants is for local plans to basically be maps that you can see clearly what all land uses are, where development should go within a city or town, and for the National Planning Policy Frameworks, that's the NPPF, to be the principal policy source for all local authorities. So the National Planning Policy Framework is a written document, and that sets out the policy for the country, which all local plans have to be in accordance with, or they should be. But the government now just wants the NPPF to be the main policy source that local authorities and developers look at for when they're developing schemes or assessing an application, and for local plans to just be map based. I'll explain a bit about what that is in a bit more in a minute. The local plans, though, can include site and area specific requirements for development. So it can say if it wants more development in certain areas, or what a bit of part of the city or town, how that should come forward. But what a map-based local plan means basically is that every part zoned area, and it will come under one of the following three areas. So there'll be growth areas, renewal areas, and protected areas. So this zoning, it's not quite like an American type zoning system that you may or may not be familiar with, where it's quite rigid. There's still a bit of flexibility in it, but essentially the government wants England to be under three different zones. So your growth areas are where sort of substantial development can go. You have sort of a development in principle, and you can kind of, if you're within, if a developer comes in and is kind of abiding by all the parameters of the growth area, so if it's providing the uses that the local plan says, and it's within the heights parameters, then you can basically just go ahead and sort of build in that area. Renewal areas are there's a few more rules to it, but it's all sort of presumption in favour of development, presumption development. And again, the local authority is the government expects local authorities to set out what you can parameters, so uses, heights, massing, those sorts of things. And if a developer is abiding by them, then they can get sort of like in principle development, and then they can come back for all the detail within subsequent planning applications. And then protected areas are pretty much what we have now. So it is applying for planning permission essentially. And this will apply for areas such as green belt, conservation areas, those sorts of areas. And you'll just have to apply for planning permission for whatever you want to do in it. So the first two are more like in development in principle. If you're within the parameters that the local authority set within their map-based local plan, then you kind of have a go ahead to sort of commence development, or apply for your detail through subsequent permissions. But you will have a permission in principle, which will give the developer certainty of what you can get on that land, and that's the idea of giving this certainty to the market that what you can get on that land. And that is it, and that will be for local authorities to set that. So they will look at their city, town, borough, and decide which areas can be growth, which can be renewal, and which should be protected. And it's up for local authorities to decide that. So that's that in a nutshell. Other things for Pillar 1 is things are changing in terms of how we are delivering housing. which is what all these changes are for, really, is to deliver housing. So the standard method for assessing housing numbers is changing to try and make sure that houses built within the areas that need them. So, for example, the southeast, compared to, so maybe the southwest, for example, or the north. You know, it all depends on where houses need to be built. And the idea is that this assessment will target that a bit more than it is at the moment. But the overall countrywide target of 300,000 houses a year remains. But how that 300,000 houses are distributed is what this standard methodology is trying to sort of change slightly. And the method will take account of existing stock within a certain area, and factors in land constraints, so such as green belt, flood risk, and that will be taken into the calculations. Also, the delivery of first homes. So this is kind of a new affordable housing product, and the government wants to see first homes of 25% of the affordable housing offer, and the LPA can then negotiate the remaining 75%, if you like. So if you've got an affordable housing offer, the government would like to see 25% of that to be first homes, and then the local authority can then decide what it wants to be affordable rent, so sort of like shared ownership type of products, or social rent, sort of your classic council housing type of accommodation. So things are changing slightly for affordable housing. The government wants to support small and medium-sized developers. So it sees those people as being quite affected by the coronavirus. They're obviously smaller, so they can't sort of, when things like this impact them, you know, they're less resilient to, say, big developers and landowners. So for small and medium-sized developers, the local authority wants to give, the government wants to give local authorities the power to sort of have discretion on CIL payments and make that a bit more flexible for them. Sort of when it's due, is it prior to commencement, is it prior to occupation? And also changing the threshold for when affordable housing contributions or affordable housing on-site provision is offered. So at the moment, the current threshold is 10 units or more, and developers either have to provide affordable housing on site or they have to give a contribution. Where the government are thinking they're looking to raise that to sites that deliver either 40 or 50 units, and to have that for a temporary period of 18 months. But they have given themselves the option to extend that 18 months if they feel it's necessary. So you could see for small and medium-sized developers that they don't have to provide affordable housing unless they are building at least 40 or 50 residential units. So that's what that is intended to do. And then finally, the extending the use of permission in principle. So this is what I was trying to describe earlier. So permission in principle establish whether the site is suitable for development and of a certain type of development. So certain type of uses, certain heights, certain massing. If you've got a permission in principle, and then there's two parts to permission in principle. That is, so if it's granted, it lasts for 5 years and there's no conditions attached at all. But you have to then submit your technical detailed consents. So you have to, that's when you're submitting further planning permissions, further plan applications to do all your detail. And that is then assessed, and that can be conditioned by the local authority, subject to conditions that you would get now as part of any development. So that they're the other things as part of Pillar 1. The other few things part of Pillar 1 that I'll quickly run through. Duty to cooperate is no longer going to be around. So this is at the moment, local authorities have a duty to cooperate with each other to make sure they are delivering the houses the country needs, to deliver things on waste management, and basically things that cross the border. So if you've got developments that are close, that's when your duty to cooperate has to come in. Or whether, for example, Warwickshire takes houses from Coventry and there's that duty to cooperate between authorities. That's going to be removed and sort of replaced. We don't know with what with yet, but some sort of sustainable development test for development in all local authority areas. But there's no detail on that yet, but that's just it, I think, that's going. Big digital thing on planning, the planning system. mainly on the local plan. So this will be, the plans have to be online, they have to be interactive, a sort of digital, rather than hard copies. It's all about putting things online so people can look at local plans digitally, and then map-based local plans, and also with people sort of interacting with the planning system, and that's all more digital than it is at the moment. There is a bigger emphasis on public engagement at the local plan development stage. So at the moment, you've probably got letters through your letterbox saying there's a planning application a few doors down. If you want to comment, please do so within 3 weeks, and the local authority will take that into account. What the government wants to do now is get this public engagement a bit more front loaded, and have it when local authorities are deciding their plans. So local people will have a greater say on whether an area should be a growth, renewal, or protection, whether things should site specific allocations. So it's all about loading it up at the front. So then when plan applications are submitted by developers or landowners, there's more certainty that that consultation process has happened, and there's more certainty that land is allocated for certain types of uses, and hopefully the local authority, the local community are more on board, because they'll have had that public engagement at the beginning, rather than sort of just when developers are submitting an application and you've only got 3 weeks to do it, to voice your concerns then. So it's all about front loading the public engagement aspect. There's an argument of whether that's more democratic or not, and whether that's a good use of public engagement, whether it should be like it is now or not. But loads are for and against for that. Retention of the neighbourhood plans, they are staying, but there's got to be potentially more emphasis or focus on design issues for neighbourhood plans, rather than say uses, because that should be captured within the local plan sort of map-based proposals. There's local plans take a long time at the moment to get published. They have to go through a long process, and it can take a few years to get these things published and in the system. So the government wants a statutory time period of 30 months for local authorities to publish their new local plans, and if they don't hit those targets, then the government reserve the right to intervene within that local authority area. And there are no changes to the Greenbelt policy, so that will stay the same as the Greenbelt has stayed the same since it came in after the war, and the government still aren't looking to change how that is, or expand it, or reduce it, or anything like that. So policies aren't changing there. So pillar 2, which is planning for beautiful and sustainable places. So this is about building better, building beautiful. There was a commission that the government drew up about building beautiful and building better. And that being at the focus of the planning system and decision making, that this should be a factor to create sort of better places. You can argue, the term beauty is always, whether that's the right word to use. It sounds, what is beauty? It sounds almost a bit Victorian, and should we be using the term beauty in this day and age? But that's what the government is using. And they want a sort of fast track approach for building beautiful, and a focus on place making in areas. The way they see to do this is sort of design codes and pattern books. So local authority, as well as their map-based local plans, the government wants them to local authorities to have design codes, which will be binding and on planning decisions. And local authorities can state how they want certain areas to develop, the design codes, what they expect from areas, and that they will be binding in decision-making processes. And the other thing with sort of this sustainable places is to improve energy efficiency of new buildings and to hit the government's carbon reduction targets. This also falls into listed building and conservation areas. So the last bullet point there is the government is currently reviewing the planning framework for listed buildings and conservation areas to ensure their significance is retained, while making it easier for certain works to be carried out, including allowing the right energy efficiency measures to support the government's zero carbon objectives. There's not too much detail on that at the moment, but the government are looking to review that as well. And finally, pillar 3, which is planning for infrastructure and the connected places. So at the moment, there is Section 106 obligations and the Community Infrastructure Levy. CIL is quite rigid. It's a tax basically on development that developers have to pay. And what the government wants to do is kind of replace both those things with the creation of a new infrastructure levy. This new levy will still be tax-based, so it will still be similar to the current one, and rates will still be set nationally as well. But the charge is trying to be based on the value of the development and is to be paid prior to occupation. At the moment, it's paid prior to commencement. So again, this is all to try and allow development to take place as quickly as possible, and then for these payments to be sort of made at sort of a later date. But the idea of the new levy, which again, there's no real detail on it yet, but the idea is for it to raise more revenue and also to include funds for affordable housing. So CIL will change slightly, but we still feel there's going to be a need for an equivalent Section 106 agreement for all the non-monetary obligations. So there's probably still going to be a need for some sort of legal agreement, which is what the Section 106 agreements are, attached to planning permissions that sort of captures things that aren't financial. So it could be things to do with don't know, maybe things like controlled parking zones or anything to do with transport, to sort of capture those things like that. But I mean, the important thing for this is for resourcing and upskilling local authorities. So part of the money could go towards that, but it's to make sure local authorities have the resources to sort of deliver on the things that local communities need. So when I mean, the government does want to extract more money from developers when they grant planning permission, and for that to go right back into the local community, and whether that's on roads, schools, affordable housing, all this, this money that local authorities can capture from developers, it can go straight into the local community to improve services and the infrastructure that there is. So my final slide, you hopefully be pleased to hear, is the devil will be in the detail. So this is very early. There's lots of detail still required. The government hasn't set out all the detail yet, but there is a clear political will to change the system. As I said at the beginning, it's not a complete dismantlement of the planning system, which is good to hear. Well, I'm pleased to hear anyway. But the government understands that planning still has a place and it matters, and it just needs a reform. But the government does need to adequately resource local authorities. I mean, I think a lot of the problems with the planning system at the moment is it isn't well resourced. Planning authorities are stretched. They are understaffed. Expertise leaves councils because they just haven't got the resources to keep, staff that have those skills. So it needs to be well equipped to deliver this new rules-based, speeded up planning system, if they are going to deliver their aims of delivering beautiful future and the houses that this country desperately needs. And that is it from me. I'll stop sharing.
Right. Shall we have some questions now? I'm sure there's things there that sound complicated and you like a bit more explanation. Can we do this in a structured way? Can you either send a message or use the reactions button at the bottom to put your hand up if you want to ask a question? Who'd like to ask the first question? Jim, you need to unmute yourself to ask a question.
I've unmuted already, I think. A question about Greenbelt, which you stated that things haven't changed since they were introduced at after the war. But in Coventry, with the 2018 local development plan, large portions of the existing Greenbelt were removed for development. So will the new system have any more effect on protecting the green belt?
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, it won't particularly have any more protection on it. It just doesn't change how local authorities can either build or not on greenbelt. So you're right. I mean, Coventry, as part of its local plan, which went through an evidence base of saying part of the greenbelt has to be built on. So and
so that is likely to continue, and they'll take another 10% in a few years' time. Of the protected greenbelt. The
system, I suppose, does allow for that as long as it's evidenced and justified. Right. Local authorities.
So one of the justifications might be that the number of houses with the new algorithm that Coventry require will now be twice as much as the existing number. In order to build the number of houses that on the existing local development plan, a lot of them were exported to Warwickshire and Nuneaton and Bedworth. But you're saying the duty to cooperate will disappear. So where are they having to build twice as many houses without having any duty for the surrounding area to take these houses? How will that happen?
Yeah, it's a good point. I don't quite know yet because the government hasn't said what they would replace it with. All they're saying is it's kind of this sustainability test. So the whole ethos of this new sort of of the planning system is that it's all presumptions in favour of sustainable development, and as long as you meet those requirements, then development should happen. And it's all about sort of making development happen a bit easier than it does at the moment. So as long as authorities are hitting those tests, then development should happen, is kind of how the government's treating it. But there still will have to be cooperation between authorities. I mean, there's no hint of any sort of regional planning coming back in. There used to be regional planning.
So the spatial channel planning won't come back?
No, that's it. There's no hint of that. So regional planning still won't really have a place. So local authorities will still have to cooperate, but I think it's going to be more on a sort of, if it's sustainable and it's within those 3 different areas and it meets those tests for those areas, then development should happen. And the housing delivery tests will try and be a bit more focused as well. So depending on how many houses Warwickshire should be delivering compared to Coventry, there's a more focused approach on that as well. But you're right, local authorities will still have to cooperate, but we just don't know the detail of that quite yet.
Right, the word sustainable is mentioned everywhere these days, and when the NPPF first came out, Greg Clark defined it as sustainable means ensuring that better lives for ourselves don't mean worse lives for future generations. So is that likely to be included in the meaning that the government would want to give?
Yeah, that's right. So that definition runs in the National Planning Policy Framework, which won't change. That will still be sort of the golden thread, if you like, that kind of runs through the planning process, the planning system.
And then in the NPPF item 35C, it says that if the plans must be effective and deliverable over the plan period, and if they're not deliverable at the moment, based on the actual houses built as against how many were required, I don't see how doubling the number will make it effective. So effectively, things won't meet the NPPF.
You're absolutely right. Yeah, local plans still have to be deliverable. So yeah, when local plans get independently inspected by the planning inspectorate, they're reviewed to make sure they're sound and they're meeting the test.
Yeah.
If the inspector doesn't think it's deliverable, he won't sign that local plan off. And
but he's being kicked up the backside to say by the government to say make sure you get this number of houses.
Okay.
Okay, carry on.
Next we'll have Les, and then Trevor, and then Geraldine.
that's right. Yeah,
So,
yeah, that's correct.
so Les next, please. Les, need to unmute yourself. Les, you need to unmute yourself.
Got it. Does Dan agree with the proposals?
Put you in the spot there, Dan.
Yeah. Yeah, do I agree with the proposals? I think the problem is we don't know what all the detail is yet. It all sounds very sort of trying to build the houses this country desperately needs, and I get the intention. I get the intention of the zoning to try and create more certainty. I get that. I mean, it's zoning is quite, yeah, we don't really have it in this country compared to others, but it still gives enough flexibility to do it. So I get the certainty and trying to build more. The white paper does have some good things in it. I don't mind some of the zoning areas. I mean, it's all for local authorities to decide. So it'll be interesting how they split up their local authority areas into those sorts of 3 areas. So yeah, there's a lot of good that could come out of the white paper. With the permitted development rights and use classes order, I'm a bit more hesitant on that because it's almost like it's making local authorities sort of just being not planners to make the best areas. It's just to abide by rules set out by national government, and you don't get that same of assessment or scrutiny because a lot of it is permitted, doesn't require planning permission. So extending those, I'm a bit more not agreeing with. I mean, I think planners should be planners and assess things on their merits, and if it's a good development, then allow it, but not be constrained by rules that don't allow planners to assess things on its own merit and just have to follow a rule book. Really, it's not how planning has ever been done in this country, and it's kind of been taken away from local authorities and imposed by the government pretty much. So I'm more positive with the white paper, and depending on what the detail is, less enthusiastic about the permitted development rights and the use classes order, I'd say.
If I could just answer a slightly different question, the council's published its response to the consultation, and it objects to most of it. Trevor,
Not surprised.
you need to unmute yourself, Trevor. Still muted. We can't hear you, Trevor. Okay, well, whilst Trevor's trying to get himself unmuted,
I think I'm done. I think I'm done.
Well done, well done, well done.
I pressed so many different icons. Dan, I understand that a particular quantum of housing will be suggested for each local authority, and the local authority's got to provide for that in these new map-based plans. But how is the local authority supposed to decide how much employment land it needs, and what justification has it got to make for example, social and community uses or health uses? And are they just supposed to be lumped into one of the growth areas or renewal areas? Is there a separate justification, if you like, for growth areas for housing and growth areas for employment?
Yeah, I mean, my understanding is that councils can distinguish that in that way. I think at the moment growth renewal protection is it's not as specific in terms of its wording. So I think if my understanding is that, yeah, I mean, there can be an intensification of industrial uses, for example, or employment, if a local authority thinks that's necessary. I mean, even within these areas, a local authority can be quite site specific in its local plan. So it can say that certain areas of the city or town have to stay employment, or even a mixed use. I don't know. I mean, you could have employment on the bottom and residential above, and they might specify that that is what they want for that area. So my understanding is that local authorities can be a little bit creative with it in terms of what they want to see in certain areas, and in order to deliver the houses that will be binding. I suppose that's the other thing that the government is doing. This will be a binding thing that authorities have to deliver this housing in their area.
But unlike existing local plans, there doesn't seem to be a need to provide a written justification for the amount of employment land or where you want to see new social facilities. You just zone that on a map, and that's your justification.
Yeah,
it just seems entirely arbitrary.
It does, yeah, because I mean, at the moment it's an evidence-based system, as you'll probably know, Trevor. That at the moment they have to justify what land they need for employment or housing. You're right. We don't know what will be coming next in this. The government hasn't really explained how local authorities will have to justify that. So yeah, you're right. But there will still be a need for it. But how yeah, you say what the justification is, I don't know yet.
Okay, Geraldine and then David West.
Okay, thank you, Dan. I found it really interesting. The one thing that I'm wondering about is how far the local authority are likely to actually engage with the public in terms of the development stage of the local plan. And would something like the Coventry Society or civic societies hold equal weight to an individual? Because obviously there's more expertise within the civic society.
Yeah, it's a good question, and again, it's one we don't know yet. At the moment, I mean, local authorities do treat amenity societies differently to just normal residents, because I think they understand the expertise they bring. They certainly do that if say if cases have to go to a planning committee, for example. If an amenity society does object, that holds a bit more weight than just an individual doing it. I mean, the government seem quite they seem to want to make sure that this public engagement is a meaningful thing, and that, I suppose, almost planning stops being done to people, and that local communities have a say in how the different what the different areas are, how this map-based local plan is developed. So they seem adamant that this is a thing, and that people should have a say. How they haven't said how it distinguishes between amenity societies and local and individual people, but I know at the moment local authorities do treat amenity societies, I say, with a bit more weight in terms of their decision making. I mean, the jury is still out on how democratic the new system will be. Some people think it's good to do it at the beginning because people can have a say right at the beginning. But the problem is, when you get individual plan applications coming in, if the local community hasn't got the same say as it does at the moment, it's like, well, actually, an individual plan application could have quite big implications that you didn't foresee when you created a growth area, for example, and you actually realise you need. So, I don't know how democratic it is at the moment, and we need to see the detail of what the government considers for this public consultation to be, really.
Okay, David West. We can't see you, David, so could you unmute yourself and speak?
Xperia X, because I'm working on two things. My phone is picking up the visuals. The PC that I'm on doesn't do visuals. So hopefully, can you hear me all right?
You're very quiet, but we can hear you.
Okay, I'll go closer to the microphone. Yes, I think Geraldine kind of pitched my my question there, which was would the consultation of the communities, would that be down to the local authorities, or would the government be putting some kind of ruling on that? I.e., if there's a protected area, would the local community be consulted before it was deemed as being a protected area or an area for growth, for example?
Yeah, that's my understanding of the limited detail that we have at the moment is that before all these areas were formally adopted within a local plan, that all local communities would have a say on it. We don't know what that would look like, how long people would have to write in, what changes could happen after people have written in. That detail just isn't there at the moment, but that is certainly the intention, because it's also telling how the government are changing slightly the neighbourhood plans, because David Cameron brought the neighbourhood plans in, and they were supposed to allow local communities to be quite prescriptive of how they wanted their immediate local area to be developed as part of the wider council local plan. And although the government is looking to keep the neighbourhood plan, its emphasis is, it looks like the government wants to change its emphasis slightly. So it's not so much on how the local area could be developed, because that I think the government wants to see that happen at the local plan development stage, in one of these either growth, renewal or protect areas. But for neighbourhood plans to focus more on design of your area and how your area will look, rather than what uses will be in that area. So the detail isn't there, but that's how we see the government sort of angle and focus leaning towards. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it's just lack of detail of this sort of stuff at the moment that the government needs to provide, but that's the way we kind of see it going.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you. Thanks. Can I just ask as well, regarding listed buildings, if, for example, a listed building is in current use as a shop, and the usage needs to be altered, or is down to be altered, would the fact that it's a listed building be taken into consideration, or would it just be, as you said earlier, that that's okay, change of usage is going to be all right in the city centres?
Yeah, so that's what I was, so the use classes order is not development, so it doesn't require permission to change the use. So you could change a listed building that's a shop into an office if you wanted to without planning permission. If you wanted to do any works to that building, now listed building includes the internal as well as external. So you can't even paint a listed building inside without applying for permission. So to do anything internal or external, you would still need planning permission. But just to change the use is not development, and you could do that whether it's a listed building or not.
Yeah. Great. Thank you, Dan. Thanks.
Next is Pete. Could you unmute yourself, Pete?
Yes, just unmuted myself. Thank you. Thanks, Dan. Thank you for the presentation.
That's right.
Two questions, really. The first one is around about the pillar about some infrastructure. The slide you gave talked about how you fund infrastructure, what the options will be for raising money to fund infrastructure. Nowhere in that did it say how you calculate what the requirements are for infrastructure in the planning process. So if you talk about highways, hospitals, GP surgeries, schools, etc., there's nothing in there that gives you any clue to what you're funding. So that's the first question. How do you see any way in these proposals how the government will approach that? But if you don't know what you require in terms of infrastructure, how do you go about funding it? The second question is going back to Jim's point. Coventry adopted a local plan. It was actually December 2017, Jim, and it goes from 2017 to 2031.
Yeah.
And in that plan is a memorandum of understanding with Warwickshire and other parts, I think. There's a review clause where the plan has to be reviewed by 2021, by March 2021. 21. And coming down from central government, it sounds like there will be zones set up which change the requirement for the delivery of houses within Coventry. So what I can't see at the moment is how can that plan stay current till 2031 when you've got all these changes coming down in the middle of the plan that needs to be reviewed by March 2021. So they're the two questions, nice simple ones.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Thanks, Pete.
Thanks, Dan.
Right, I'll try and answer them. Okay, so the first one, in terms of contributions, so we don't know for sure, but we anticipate that it'll work similar to how it does at the moment. So local authorities at the moment dictate how much money goes towards certain things in their area. The government sets the price per square metre for any development. And local government, and local authorities then decide what uses. Local government still set the price per square metre, but the local government, the government sets how that is calculated. Local authorities can set how the price per square metre that they will receive from developments, and also what it is spent on. So all authorities will have what they call a 1, 2, 3 list. Coventry, I'm sure, will have one, but that says what they can spend community infrastructure money on. That could be on roads, schools, hospitals, as you say. So they decide what they do it on. We anticipate that will carry on, but we just don't know. I mean, the detail isn't there, but at the moment, it's still for local authorities to decide what they spend it on. And we anticipate that to be sort of going forward, but say we don't know. So does that answer the first bit fully? Oh, sorry, Pete, you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry, it partly does, but it partly doesn't say, does the new requirement say what are the requirements on local authorities to calculate and specify what infrastructure they need? They can decide how much they're getting through a formula, but you know, if you take our current situation where new road junctions are being built on the A45, there's discussion of a relief road in Kersley, the hospital says it's got no capacity, we need GP surgery schools. What would be the process under the new system for calculating what's needed? What would be the requirement to specify what you need to make sure the whole thing's sustainable?
Yeah, sure. I don't know at this moment, but at the moment, local authorities do set how much CIL, community infrastructure level money, goes towards certain things. How much can go on the roads, how much can go on to education and things like that. So it might continue that way, but yeah, I don't know what justification they have to do for what goes where. I mean, obviously with developers paying all this money, it's all under scrutiny, and if local authorities don't spend the money like they should do, then you know that I'm sure developers do have a mechanism to sort of either, I think it still exists at the moment, where they can claim that money back if they want to, if it's not spent within a certain time frame. I think local authorities have different time frames, but you have to spend it in a certain time frame, and on the thing the local authority says it has to spend it on. And I think if they don't, I think developers can ask for that money back. I think that's part of the regs, but I don't know how it will quite work in the future. But we anticipate it will be based on a similar model. I think it's just to try and make CIL work better, because when CIL came in, it was supposed to be this like amazing thing that encompassed everything, and it was simple, and everyone would know what they were paying because it was a tax, and it wouldn't be based on Section 1 and 6 contributions, which are, you know, worked out slightly differently. But I think what people have found out is that CIL just hasn't worked how it should have done. It's complicated. Big schemes, big phase developments don't work for CIL, and it's just made the whole thing more complicated. So I think the government wants to simplify it, but I imagine it will be based similar on what it is at the moment. But we just don't have the detail at the moment, I'm afraid, Pete, to sort of say.
That's okay. Just for information, Coventry don't use CIL at all. They refuse.
Okay, right. I didn't realise that.
We've now got Ian Stevenson, then Brian Stoke, then Derek Robinson. And welcome to Ian Stevenson, who's our latest member of the society, having joined today. Welcome.
Thank you, John. I'm representing the Westwood Heath Residents Association, and I thought I would do you the justice of joining the society as well. And
Thank you.
in return for this excellent presentation. So thanks for the invitation originally, and also thanks to Dan for the presentation. There's lots of things running through my head. But the question that I've asked there is about what, you've had more time to contemplate this, Dan, than the rest of us. What do you think the most significant impact on Coventry will be as a result of these changes?
Well, good question. I think it's probably going to be on housing numbers, mainly because that's what the government's intention is for all these changes. I think, yeah, there'll be a lot more probably housing development in the city required to. Yeah, and it's probably the density of housing as well, because there's obviously the traditional sort of houses that you get there, but I think there might be more emphasis on areas being a bit more denser to accommodate all this housing, especially as the Greenbelt policy hasn't changed. So the government haven't decided that Greenbelt should be given over to housing. Although local authorities to the local plan can do that, if as Coventry have done in Easton Green and Kersley. So I think it might be the density of development that Coventry might see different, the number of houses, and I suppose a change to the city centre as well, and what uses are actually going to be in the city centre in the future, are probably the two main things that I see this doing. I mean, it'd be interesting in a place like Coventry, how it allocates its zoning areas. I mean, there's obviously all the conservation areas will be protected, but it's those areas that aren't, and maybe more on the fringes of the city. How will they develop? Will it still be more the inner cities that see this denser development that's a bit more for growth? Will it be the outer areas? Yeah, it'll be interesting. But I do think a density of housing and maybe and sort of how the city centre will, and also the local town centres that there are around, and how they'll develop.
Okay,
Could
Brian.
I just have a quick follow up?
Yeah,
John, thanks.
carry on, Ian. Yeah.
One of the other things that I picked up on is this removal of the duty to cooperate, and one of the issues that we see on the fringes of the city is how the trade-offs are made between the two different councils at the moment. So the way that Coventry can dump its overspill into Warwickshire have to take it. So I'm just thinking of things like, well, who would define the zone arrangement, say in Warwickshire, that border onto Coventry, and how would they arrive at that decision? And would Warwickshire have a duty to consult with Coventry residents in assessing the needs? It just seems to me that that's a bit of a minefield, I think.
Yeah. I mean, obviously these areas will be defined when the local plan's being developed, and local authorities should be talking to each other, and Warwickshire will be able to comment on Coventry's local plan. Equally, Coventry will comment on Warwickshire's, and they will have to work together. And you would hope they could work together where growth areas meet each other, and you don't get, I don't know, so protected next to growth. Don't know. It depends how that would work, but they would still have to cooperate, and for plans to be made sound by the planning inspectorate, they would have to see that local authorities have worked together, and so both plans work side by side. But you're right. I mean, it's how that will work going forward. The detail of that still hasn't come up, because the government haven't given us what will replace the duty to cooperate. They've just said it's going to be a sort of sustainable test arrangement, but they haven't given us any detail of what will replace it. But I imagine they will still have to. And I suppose even the housing delivery targets will have to be discussed as well. I'm sure at local authority level. and whether Warwickshire can still take Coventry's allocation or whether it all has to be within Coventry's boundary, and Coventry has to have more growth areas than it used to, or I don't know. It's all these different, it could go off in various different ways, and I suppose local authorities can decide how they wanted to do it themselves, and there might be different ways of doing it. Different local authorities will take different approaches, but yeah, there will have to be some working together, because otherwise you won't create the local, that sustainable future that the government wants if local authorities don't work together. So it will have to happen in some form.
Okay, thanks.
I'm going to try and end this meeting at 9, so we've got 10 minutes for any last questions. I've got Brian Stoke, Derek Robinson, David West and Paul Maddox. So Brian, please.
Okay, this is really, I think, a follow-up to Geraldine's question. Virtually every consultation locally that I've ever attended seems to take the same pattern, where we have a number of people there who are there to explain the plans that are on the table or on the wall, but actually they don't seem to want to take any kind of criticism or comment about what might need to be changed. We made lots of suggestions, but the most beautiful example to me was the Broadgate redevelopment, where I went to the consultation for that, and I said, alongside apparently many others, that we must have green space in Broadgate. And one of the people who was speaking to us said, yes, we've had 2/3 of the people who've come in so far have mentioned that, but clearly we didn't get any in the end. We only got some outside Holy Trinity. But it seems to me that there's very little actual consultation been going on, really. I wondered whether the alterations to involving the public earlier in the process might actually mean that there's a little bit more public influence than there has been in the past.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Brian. Yeah, it's that's the hope, because I mean, I believe in what planning does, and that's why I've come into this profession. I still work in it, and when planning came in after the war from the Labour government, it was all about communities benefiting from development that happens, and communities seeing a direct benefit, and it being a form of social good, like the NHS was, like free education was, like the welfare state was. It came about in that era, and over time it's just been somehow slowly eroded, and people don't believe planning works for them, and don't see the goods that the welfare state still provides, or the NHS still provides, and no one sees it as being a good thing. And that's because people, they go to these consultation events, they see that they've already sort of sorted it all out, they're not going to listen to me, and nothing will change. And so it's just planning being done to people rather than for people, and it's sad that planning's gone that way, and planners aren't really respected, and local authorities aren't respected, and no one has faith in local authorities to deliver what they think communities need. So the hope is that yes it will, and I hope that's what the government really wants to do with this front-loading public consultation. But I mean, I hope there's still the democratic process after that, when applications come in and that things can be slightly changed. But obviously local authorities and communities will have to accept, once a local plan is adopted, then the principle of development, whether that's for growth or protection, then that's kind of set, and you're having to work within that parameter, but to still get the best development you can for the local area. So hopefully the democratic process will still carry on. But front loading it might help, because at least people will hopefully feel more engaged from the start, and maybe hopefully want to keep being engaged. And maybe the digitization of the planning process will help with that as well. If more can be put online, and it's more interactive, and there's just more consultation going on, rather than just like your 2 nights in a local hall or school or somewhere, and that's all the public gets to see the plans, then maybe there can be more people will feel more engaged in it. But I mean, I really hope that's the case, Brian, because that's what I think planning should be about, and I think it should be about the public good and creating a benefit to the community. So hopefully that is what will happen.
Thank you.
Derek Robinson.
Right, thank you. I'm totally confused by Coventry's complete disregard to the Greenbelt Act. I see every bit of green land being built on, all trees removed and concrete everywhere. Why does the government make the green belt rules and Coventry's planners just ride roughshod over them and don't even discuss it with us? Job done by them and below us. Over to you.
Yeah, no, I hear it saying, Derek, and yeah, it's the current process allows for, you know, green belt is protected, but it's not protected. You can build on it, but you have to. You have to justify it very well, and it's stricter than everywhere else. But green belt doesn't mean you can't build on it, but it's very difficult. And Coventry has, I don't know the process they went through, but they've obviously justified and got their local plan through, and it's all been seen as sound that they can take these bits of green belt, these areas out of the green belt, build on it, and that's all been made sound. I say I don't know the detail of that, but you're right, and the lack of consultation doesn't help that process, because again, people just see it as local authorities doing what they want, and not engaging with people. I mean, there's the green belt policies is one of them that I say hasn't really changed since the 1950s when it came in. A lot of people say it should be reviewed because it hasn't changed, and that's quite strange that a policy hasn't changed for so long. And it's not to say that we have to get rid of the green belt, it's just maybe we have to reassign green belt or realise what green belt needs to do, or maybe there are parts of green belt that can be built on and others that really shouldn't, and you should really protect certain parts, but maybe other parts can be built on, depending on sort of what its makeup is. I mean, I'm always torn in Coventry. I mean, my parents live next to the Eastern Green bit that's being built on, and I have a constant debate with my dad, who has a similar view of like, why should we build on the green belt? And I come from, well, I can't afford my own house yet, and we need houses. And does it matter if the green belt gets built on, if it's the right place for it? But then you're arguing green belt versus the city. Should you densify the city, or should you build on green belt? You know, should inner city areas go really high and have loads of flats, or do you give the green belt over so you don't have to densify the inner city? There's all these debates, but I do hear what you're saying, Derek, and it's not helpful when consultation isn't as good as it probably should be in the planning process. But the current system does allow it to be built on, and Coventry has managed to do that in Eastern Green and Kersley. But yeah, that's all I can really offer at the moment on that, I'm afraid.
David West.
So you're saying I'm right, but I'm still wrong, and you won't discuss it with me, and you'll carry on and build on it anyway.
What's the question?
I said you're saying I'm right and wrong, and you'll go ahead and build on it anyway.
On the green belt?
And yeah, I mean, Coventry will build on it anyway by looks of things. I mean, they've got their local plan through, and they're already putting plan applications for roads and infrastructure around there. Yeah, that's yes. I mean, if they see this land as being needed to deliver their housing requirements. I mean, that will have been what they have had to have justified it against, that they need the land to build the houses that the government to charge them with to provide, and they see that they're needing this land in order to meet their 5-year housing land supply and their housing delivery targets, and they've decided the green belt is the way they're going to do it, and that's how Coventry Council has progressed it. But yeah, I appreciate that it's going to, a lot of people aren't going to be happy about it.
If I could just add that the formula that the Lichfields have come up with gives something like 2,400 houses a year to be built in Coventry, which is twice the target from the local plan and about 3 times what's being built at the moment. So I think, you know, not just the green belt we've already lost, it could be the rest of the green belt could be under threat if those targets had to be met. Anyway, last question to Paul Maddox.
Thank you, Dan. It's not going to be much of a question because you're not going to have time to answer it. I'm always frightened of zones. I mean, Coventry's gone through lots of zones. I mean, do you remember there was going to be a restaurant zone down? And any of the places they suggested where the restaurant zone was going to be, it never happened. You can't force commerce to do things. And one of the problems also with zones is that that's how out-of-town shopping happened, where you got, you know, sort of massive, big sort of, you had to have a car to go there, and it just killed the town centre. So sometimes planning like that actually is detrimental. Also, what is interesting, what Trevor said, there's a large areas of what used to be factories, massive factory sites, that are now housing. So if there was, say, suddenly a revolution where they found out they could make something and Coventry could manufacture it, where would we build the factories? There's nowhere to build them. So it's always sort of a base, sort of like we're forcing ourselves in just to being housing. Now, also, there's nowhere in the planning is the people that own land or own property that are actually just sitting on it and not, I'm just waiting for it to go up in price. Now, supermarkets do this. They get a prime site. They won't let anybody else build on it, but they, you know, they won't release it. And that happens with, they can build luxury flats and never rent them out. So there's got to be legislation where if you've got an empty property, you're taxed really heavily to actually rent them out. And on the basis of Article 4 directive, Coventry's never really pursued that. The only time they ever did it was over Copswood House. And that was really sort of had to be forceful to do it. They've never done it in any of the MH houses of multiple occupation. They've devastated areas in the city where neighbourhoods were suddenly having student accommodation, private landlords from foreign countries and investments taking over houses, forcing as many students in as they can possibly can, and then sort of declining the area. They could have easily put Article 4 directive and said only a certain amount of limited housing, and it's hit not just poor areas like Charterhouse, even very expensive areas near Warwick University. So I think that the Coventry City Council have got no teeth, and this is actually going to take out what teeth they did have. And so you're basically just going to say Coventry's got no planning.
No, I agree with a lot of what you said there. I mean, I mean, I think when planning first came involved, I mean, it first came in the after the war. It was designed to stop. You know, there was a tax on the land to prevent that sort of thing happening. I mean, it's not just supermarkets; it's house builders do it. It's like they won't build all the houses they've got permission for because they drip it in almost because the house prices will stay high. If they flood it all in one go, then they might not get as much for their flats. But so yeah, all people do it. But like I say, if you had a land tax or something like that, that could prevent that sort of thing happening. But I mean, the government hasn't suggested doing that as part of this white paper. So I don't think we're going to see anything like that. Sorry, Paul. What were your other points after that?
It wasn't really. It was not so much. I didn't expect, because we're trying to finish at 9 o'clock. I didn't expect you'd have time to actually answer. It was more of a statement. It's that it doesn't seem to, and it's. I think that the white paper and what you've been talking about is only just the start of a long road of the fight that local government's got to play against the government. The government want to rule it, and they want to make every city dance to their tune. And Coventry used to be a leading council, planning, introducing open spaces and green space, public transport, all these type of things they actually planned for. Now it's been taken out of their hands. And I was not really asking for an answer on this. I'm just making a statement. Sorry for the rant. Thank you.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's the same rant we have a lot, professionally. It's like, I mean, it's permitted development rights is taking the control out of local authorities. The government's automatically giving planning permission for all these things now. I mean, it's part of suppose, Tory government, I suppose, rather than maybe a Labour government who, you know, the Tories are a lot more market led. So they see planning as kind of a barrier to you know, the market and the enterprise and the economy and things, and really it's not. And as if you have a well-funded planning system and you put the right taxes in and planning works for the people, then it doesn't have to be a barrier, and it can really help the economy, and it can create the society you want. I mean, it's not just about, you know, making money. It's about creating people that people want to live. I mean, planning was supposed to be for the people. I mean, planning was about happiness and healthy cities, and it should go back to those principles, really, I think. And I don't know if it's slightly been lost over the decades, but that's what planning was invented for. It should still do that. And you're right, governments are taking more and more away from local authorities, which I'm always uncomfortable with, because I think local authorities are the best place to decide for their local areas, and they're elected, and the local people elect their councillors, and that's where it should reside. And I do always get nervous when the government take more and more power, which they seem to be might be doing with all these powers. But yeah, I agree with a lot of what you're saying, Paul, to be honest.
Okay. There was one other question that's been asked, and I'll ask it myself rather than pass it over. But land banking is a big issue. I've heard that there's something like 1 million houses with planning permission held by the big house builders who have an interest in keeping prices up, and they're not releasing them. I couldn't find anything in the white paper that was going to address that. Have you heard anything?
No, I haven't, which is kind of my answer to Paul. We haven't seen anything that kind of addresses that in any sort of, yeah, tax or which seems strange when we're trying to get houses built. But I mean, the cynic in me then says, well, it's a Tory government and they've got all their chums, haven't they? But I mean, I won't say any more on that. So maybe that's why there's nothing in it. But no, I haven't seen anything, John. No.
Okay, thank you. Just then to remind everyone that this is a consultation exercise. You have until midnight on the 29th of this month to respond to the consultation. If you want to follow that up, if you just Google planning for the future, you'll quickly find the document, and there's a list of questions that are being asked as part of the consultation. We've been promised world-beating consultation, which started on the 6th of August, and anyone who's involved in consultation knows you never start consultation in the middle of the August bank holiday. No one responds. So the Coventry Society, we're going to do our own response, but perhaps more importantly, Civic Voice, which is the umbrella group for all civic societies, is going to put in a response, and I think that'll be very powerful because they are a huge voice in the country, and I'm hoping that even if we're not listened to, they will be. I'd like to thank Dan for a tremendous presentation and for so ably answering all those difficult questions. And I'm glad I'm not sitting there. It's an impossible task. So thank you, Dan, and thank you everyone for coming to this meeting. Does anyone want to have any last final say? Pete, do you want to say something, or is that just a thumbs up?
That's just a thumbs up to Dan to thank you.
Yes, thank you. Okay.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks,
I'll now close the meeting, and thank you all for coming. Thank you.